Hey everyone, it's Scott Montern with Scott's RPG Reviews. We're actually going to not do a review today. We're going to talk about a topic that everybody's been talking about, which is Cynthia Williams resigning from Hasbro, Wizards of the Coast. She was president of Wizards of Hasbro Gaming, I think is the official division she was called, is Hasbro Gaming. Before I get into a discussion about her resignation and my thoughts about Hasbro, I want to start with, I grew up with D&D. I cut my teeth with the very first RPG I played was the D&D cardboard box from the 1970s, from like, 75, 76, 77, sometime in there. And then went on to AD&D and Tunnels and Trolls by Flying Buffalo. And that was where I got my introduction to RPGs. And I played for a long time. I played D&D from maybe 77 and 78 all the way through 87 or 88. And then I moved on and did other stuff. So I have a fondness for the D&D that came out of TSR. And the stuff that Hasbro's been doing has been really, really problematic on so many levels. You have the OGL scandal, you have the AI scandal, you have the firing of all those employees. You have the Baldur's Gate 3 situation, which is not an RPG, but a computer game that they're not going to make any more, and they're not going to do any expansions, they're not going to do any patches, I guess, not even any patches to it. Really problematic. And then, even though Wizards of the Coast, that branch of Hasbro, is their most profitable, it did not make as much money in 2023 as it did in 2022. Which doesn't surprise me because we're coming out of COVID and people's attitudes are changing. And where they're spending their money is changing. When we were all locked home at COVID, it wasn't like we were taking vacations and stuff. So, but no big surprise, just before the financials go out, I think next week, the president, Cynthia Williams, that's her name, resigned, which was not unsurprising, to be perfectly honest. But I think it points to something that Hasbro's trying to do, which I'm not convinced is necessarily going to be an effective strategy. So if you look at kind of companies as a whole, there's a lot of effort, particularly in tech companies, to move from what we call single licensing or permanent licensing to software as a service models. And this is everywhere. All these tech industries are trying to move to this model where revenue, instead of being you're constantly having to make new sales in order to generate revenue, where you've got subscribers that are paying you a monthly fee, whether that be Google Workspace or AWS or even online games, multiplayer online games. All of these run under the model of you're going to pay us money every month. And from a corporate perspective, for these companies, it's really good because it creates predictable revenue that you know, okay, we've got 50,000 subscribers, assuming that we only lose, say we lose 5,000, we're down to 45,000. We know what our revenue, our base core revenue stream is going to be, even if we don't make any sales. It also kind of, from a work effort perspective, makes a lot of sense because when you're talking about tech industries, you're having to maintain, particularly internet-related industries, you're having to maintain servers, you're doing software updates. There's ongoing effort to constantly keep the product updated. Every time an OS update happens, you have to make sure that your software still works. So there is a certain level from a tech industry perspective that it makes sense to move towards a software as a service model. But now let's talk about Hasbro and D&D and Magic the Gathering, and even their toys. If Hasbro sells me a set of D&D books, Game Master's Guide, Monster Manual, it's not like once they've sold it to me, they're not doing anything more to that thing that I bought. They're not updating it. And it's interesting because there are actually models where you can do that, where you can provide updates. The legal system does that through something called pocket parts, where you buy a reference item for a book, and then they issue pocket parts once a year, which are updates to the content. Really important in the legal industry, obviously. But it's not like if I go out and buy a player's handbook that 6 months down the line they're going to issue me an update to that player's handbook. So that whole software as a service model, ongoing revenue model, doesn't make a lot of sense for the print industry, because it's not like they're doing ongoing effort. Now, it does create a challenge, because I put out a player's handbook and I'm selling it, and then suddenly everybody who wants it buys it. The only way I can generate more revenue is to do a new version of the player's handbook, and there has to be something useful, which has been one of the big speculations, is the new version of D&D really going to have anything useful compared to 5e? Most people say, yeah, probably not. It's just going to be some minor tweaks. So, Hasbro is trying to put a square peg in a round hole, and I think that's what caused a lot of their problems with respect to D&D, is that the traditional print edition model does not work. People will retaliate it as a software, as a ongoing subscription model. Which is why Hasbro, even though they won't directly say it, says we want to kill the print industry. We want to move everything to D&D Beyond. And some kind of online service where they can force you to basically pay a subscription fee. I'm running a campaign, it's running under D&D Beyond, and I have to keep paying you, otherwise my campaign, all the stuff I've created for my campaign kind of withers and dies because you delete my files on me. If we were in the COVID age, that actually might work, because you had most people running games online. But we're coming out of the COVID age. Their timing is wrong. I'm getting more as a GM, more and more demands for running RPGs in person. I'm running one on Saturday, I'm running one on Sunday, and I'm running one the following Friday and one the following Saturday. All of them in-person games with 5 or more players. So I think Hasbro's model of, well, we want to move to a subscription-based service, we want to move it all online, just doesn't work for the direction things are going. So Hasbro has to seriously rethink how they're going to generate revenue with D&D. The answer was, now, TSR and Wizards of the Coast do not have a particularly good track record with D&D and generating a ton of revenue. I don't think it'll ever generate a ton of revenue. It'll never be $1 billion industry, I don't think. Well, probably never be $1 billion industry. But the way you generate revenue is you constantly generate more content, more useful stuff that people want. Don't just force someone to pay for the same content month for month after month. Generate new content, generate new interesting stuff, generate online magazines. Like, I pay for an online magazine, or pay for a print magazine for that matter. So I think this whole subscription model is unworkable. I think moving everything online is a disaster. All it's going to do is make things... Trying to move everything online is just one more scandal that's going to make things worse, and their reputation is going to get worse. Now, that's the D&D side. I want to talk about Magic the Gathering. I'm not a Magic the Gathering player. I've got a lot of friends that are. I find the whole thing really just kind of interesting. I don't understand the chase which is involved with getting cards and everything. I mean, I see what happens. I just don't understand why you want to do it. Everything I hear about that side of the Wizards of the Coast is that there's a pretty solid potential revenue stream, an ongoing revenue stream. Every time a new release comes out, all the same people go out and buy a new set of boxes. Essentially a new revenue stream. But everything I've heard said that that's being mismanaged as well on a couple of layers. First one is that they've had a series of very bad releases, some which they've actually had to pull. And second one is the quality of the cards themselves. So the contents have been a problem. And I'm hearing people saying, you know what, these cards just don't have the quality that they used to. And I'm like, man, you're blowing $100, $200, $300, or in one case, I think, $1,000 for a box for cards. They better have made a solid goal if I'm spending that amount of money on them, to be perfectly honest. But it sounds like they have quality control issues on the Magic the Gathering side. So, what are my thoughts? It's two things happened at the same time, which I found really interesting, or kind of in the same year. You had the OGL scandal with D&D, which I found academically very interesting, but honestly, when that whole thing came down, I wasn't RPGing. I had left RPGs in favor of board games when that whole scandal happened. So I said, oh yeah, interesting. My wife plays at D&D. My friends that play D&D, but it doesn't really affect me. Other than I had friends who were trying to make money who suddenly said, this is a big problem. But I got sucked back into RPGs thanks to Old Gods of Appalachia coming out, and I was just entranced by that whole system. And when I started getting back into RPGs, I said, you know what? I just don't want to deal with the politics behind Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast. Yes, it is the most popular gaming system, and yes, if you're doing videos on YouTube and you want to be a good YouTube promoter, you have to do D&D. There's been endless talk about that, which is one of the reasons why I'm doing this video. But I don't want to play with those politics, and I don't want to be put in a situation where the rules are changing on me, which is kind of where Hasbro's getting themselves in trouble. They're changing rules around, and people don't like it. So I've been looking at other systems. I actually did an inventory. I have 300 different books from other RPGs other than D&D. It's about maybe 60 different systems. Everything from Cypher System to Numenera to Blade Runner to Alien to Symborum to Forbidden Lands. I was actually reading the Dungeon World book this afternoon. I thought it was kind of interesting, to Savage Worlds. There's so many systems out there. I think if Hasbro isn't careful, their control over D&D's control over the RPG community may slowly slip with time. Maybe. They have a huge control right now, so I'm not convinced. But they may start to lose that almost exclusive control over the RPG market. I mean, right now, if you talk RPGs, you're talking D&D to most people. I'm not sure whether that's a good or bad thing. For me personally, I think it's a good thing. I like all the options. I like to use all of them. But it's going to be hard for producers, because if you don't have one system that everybody's writing to, that means that I have a lot of discussion with this. People say, I wrote this book for D&D 5e. Well, did you write it for Cypher System? Did you write it for Year Zero Engine? Did you write it for D20? If you didn't, I don't want to talk to you. I just don't want it. So it's going to be harder if we have this kind of disbursement out of D&D to a bunch of different systems. It's going to be harder on our authors who are creating content, because they can't say, I'm going to write to this, I'm going to write to this, and expect to get the same amount of revenue. So, yeah, very mixed feelings. I have a very big fondness for D&D. I love D&D. I grew up with D&D. But Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast have just made a nightmare. And everything I see, they do it worse. It's not like they fix things or they won't learn their lesson. Guys, learn your lesson. If I were the new president of Wizards of the Coast, which I'm obviously not going to be, I have another job, the first thing I would do is sit down with my customer base and say, let's sit down and talk about what you want, what our needs as a company are, and see if there is some kind of combination of that actually works. It may be that there isn't. It may be that, look, we need to make money, we have shareholders, and these are our costs, and here's how it works, and we come up and decide, you know what, it's just not workable, we're not going to do D&D anymore. That can happen. That happens all the time. But they're making their decisions in a vacuum, or rather a customer vacuum, that ultimately they're shooting themselves in the foot. Every week they do something stupid. I forgot about the 50th anniversary book scandal. They've got that book which is outrageously expensive, I'm not going to buy yet. And they made some statements about the original creators of D&D that were really horrible. Somewhat true, but really, I think, portrayed inappropriately. So, to my advice to Hasbro, not that you're listening to this channel, but if you were, the answer is whoever the new president of Hasbro, or the new president of Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro Gaming, or whatever they're going to call that position is I would sit down and talk with, not your shareholders, not your corporate employees, sit down and talk with your customers. Now, you've got two different sets of customers. You've got players and GMs like me. You have content creators. Sit down with those people and talk to them and see what their needs are and see what you can do about it. That's interesting, because I hadn't thought about that. Someone had made this comment, which is, they said, Hasbro's acting as though their customers are their shareholders and not their customers. All of their decisions are driven by their shareholders and not by their customers. which I get, but, and because your shareholders are the ones that keep officers in power, and they're the ones who own the company. Shareholders own the company. But shareholders don't generate revenue. Oh, that's a good thing to say. Shareholders don't generate revenue. Customers generate revenue. If you're focused on your shareholders and not on your customers, that's your problem. You need to focus on your customers and see what you can do to get your customers to open up their pocketbooks. And don't do it in a vacuum. Talk to them and say, okay, you bought the Player's Handbook, you bought the GM Guide, you bought the Monster Manual. You bought Ravenloft. Let's say you bought Ravenloft. I need you to spend more money with me in order for us to stay in business. What kinds of things do you want to see? That's what they ought to be doing. Okay, that's enough. I just thought I would weigh in on the D&D scandals, whatever. Best of luck to Cynthia Williams wherever she's headed. And hopefully they'll get someone in as president of Wizards of the Coast who will do a great